The rain had just stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and glistening under the weak afternoon sun. I was crouched by the service bay, my hands black with grease. The faint smell of burnt oil clinging to my clothes. The other mechanics had gone for lunch, but I stayed, tinkering with the carburetor of a rusted-out sedan that no one else wanted to bother with. That's my life in a nutshell, doing the jobs no one else wanted, for pay that barely covered the rent. From the corner of the garage, I could hear them three young men in clean jackets, laughing loudly, their voices sharp with the kind of arrogance you don't forget. They weren't here for repairs. They'd pulled up in a gleaming red sports car, engine purring like a predator, just to talk to the owner about the upcoming weekend race. I didn't look up at first. I'd learned a long time ago that staring too long at men like them could get you in trouble. But when I heard my name, well, my nickname, I froze. "Hey, Grease Monkey," one of them called out, and the others erupted in laughter. I straightened, slowly, wiping my hands on a rag, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. "You talking to me? Who else?" The tallest one smirked. He had a perfect smile, the kind you see in commercials, the kind that hides cruelty just under the surface. "We were just wondering if you ever fixed anything that wasn't already." Halfway to the junkyard, the others laughed again, and something hot and familiar rose in my chest. I'd been here before, in the shadow of other people's pride, reduced to a joke. I bit down the first words that came to mind. The shop owner, Mr. Lawson, came out from his office, his expression tight. "Boys, take it outside. This isn't the place." But they ignored him. "Actually," the tall one continued, "we've got an idea. My uncle's sponsoring the Riverside Speedway this Saturday. Big race, big crowd. You see that beauty outside?" He jerked his thumb toward the red sports car. "She's untouchable. No one's beaten me in over a year. But, tell you what," he tilted his head, "not considering. You win a race against me, I'll give you a job. Full-time, real pay. Maybe even a shot at driving for my team." I felt the air shift in the garage. A few of the guys who'd been watching from the doorway leaned in, their curiosity sharp as glass. I opened my mouth, then closed it. My chest was tight, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of memory. They didn't know. They couldn't know. 2 years ago, I'd walked away from racing for good. Not because I wasn't good enough, God knows I was, but because one rainy night, one reckless driver, and one shattering crash had cost me more than any trophy could make up for. I hadn't been behind the wheel since. I told myself it was because the bills wouldn't wait, because my mother's health needed me steady. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was afraid. And now, here they were, dangling the one thing I told myself I didn't need anymore. "I'm not interested," I said finally, going back to the carburetor. My hands trembled just enough for me to notice. "Oh, come on," the tall one pressed, his voice dripping with challenge. "Afraid you'll lose? Or is it that you don't want everyone to see you're just a nobody who hides behind broken engines?" Something snapped inside me. I could take the insult. I could take the laughter. But the way he said nobody, like he was speaking a truth, I couldn't deny burned in my chest like acid. I looked up slowly, meeting his gaze. "And what do I get if I win?" The smirk widened. "I already told you. A job. A real one. Not this." He waved a hand at the grease-streaked floor like it was something filthy. "And maybe if you're lucky a little respect." I didn't look at him again. I looked past him, through the open garage door, at the strip of sky just visible over the rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, I could almost hear the roar of an engine, the echo of cheers, the wind slamming against my helmet. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "Fine. Saturday." The garage went quiet for half a second. Then the laughter came again, louder, sharper. But underneath it, I caught something else, a thin thread of anticipation. They thought they'd just set me up to fail. They had no idea they'd just lit the fuse. The Riverside Speedway didn't look like a racetrack on weekdays. It looked like a place that had forgotten the sound of thunder. I stood at the chain-link fence at dawn, fingers laced through the cold metal, watching fog curl along the straightaway. Like a sleeping animal's breath, the grandstands were empty, the flags hung limp, and somewhere beyond the far bend a maintenance cart rattled past, its driver too absorbed in his coffee to notice me. I told myself I'd only come to walk the perimeter, to feel the ground under my feet, to make sure the past didn't knock me flat the moment I stepped onto the tarmac. But the truth was simpler and heavier. I came to see if the ghosts would let me breathe. I could still feel Saturday coming like a storm front, pressure building, the air changing shape. The boys at the garage had spent the afternoon retelling my answer as if they'd been the ones who'd said it. Mr. Lawson tried to talk me out of it with a kind of worried kindness that made me feel young again. "You don't owe them anything," he'd said, hands in his pockets, eyes on the oil slick floor. "People like that don't offer chances. They set traps." I told him I knew. I didn't tell him that I'd decided long before they finished. Laughing, I didn't sleep much. When I did, the old crash found me, same as always. The night rain, the headlights carving the track into shards, the car to lengths ahead spinning on a patch of oil. I remember the decision tap the brakes. Keep the line. Don't overcorrect, and the gut-deep certainty that I'd done it right. Then the hit from behind, a shudder like a body breaking, the guardrail exploding into sparks, as if the sky had poured stars onto the ground. I don't remember how I crawled out. I remember the silence afterward, a silence louder than the crash. The ICU fluorescence. My mother's hand on my cheek, her voice trying not to shake as she said, We can stop now. We can stop and still have a life. Her health had already been the quiet countdown behind every decision I made. She was the kind of woman who folded worry into flour and sugar and fed it back to you as cake. Who saved good news for last and bad news for when you were already sitting down? Heart issues, the doctor had said years earlier, gently, like he was afraid the word might bruise her. Manageable if she rested, dangerous if she didn't. So I picked up extra shifts. I stopped traveling. I told myself racing could wait, because she couldn't. When the crash came, it felt less like fate than a final nudge toward what I'd been promising I would do. I had become good at not thinking about it. The track, the noise, the hunger in the chest that only speed and precision could satisfy. I traded that hunger for smaller things, steady pay, a bed that didn't move. The rhythm of the garage where clutches and carburetors told the same stubborn story, in different languages, but the body remembers what the mind buries. When I closed my eyes at the fence, I could still count the seconds between corners, still feel the weight transfer through the chassis like a silent sentence. Commit, commit, commit. Marcus, a voice said behind me. For a second my name didn't sound like mine. I turned. The security guard was older than me by 20 years, sturdy in the way of men who've stood outside long enough to learn how to be weatherproof. He squinted, then smiled. Didn't think I'd see you here again. I searched his face and found it wan. He used to wave me through the gate with a two-finger salute back when I carried a laminated pass, with my name printed in bold letters, back when announcers sounded like they were singing when they introduced me, back when the kids in the bleachers drew birds on poster board. Because someone once called me the Falcon and it stuck. Just walking, I said. He looked at my hands. Black crescents of grease still lodged under the nails. You still fixing things? Sometimes they let me, I said, and he huffed a laugh like an engine coughing back to life. He unlocked the gate without asking why I was there so early. Go on then. She'll know if you're lying to her. Who? He tilted his head toward the track. The girl you used to be in love with. I wasn't. He grinned. You know what I mean. The track doesn't return feelings. But she'll tell you whether you can stand on her and keep your legs steady. I walked out onto the asphalt like someone stepping onto a stage they swore they'd never visit again. It was darker than it looked from the fence. The rubber ground into it over 1,000 races, painting it the color of old thunderclouds. At turn 1, I crouched and pressed my palm to the surface. Warm, even after a cool night. The kind of warmth that remembers friction as affection. Marcus, a smaller voice this time, breathless. I stood and found a boy jogging along the apron, one arm hugging a helmet that was clearly too big for him. He had braces that flashed when he smiled, and shoes that squeaked with each step. I recognized him after a BT lie. The kid who hung around the garage on Saturdays, pretending to help by handing me tools I didn't ask for. He came up shy to my shoulder and somehow vibrated with the energy of a blinking sign. "You're really going to race?" he blurted. The words tumbled out like he'd been holding them in for hours. "I heard at the shop. I mean, I didn't hear here. But then Josh told Dave, and Dave told, well, everyone." He stopped, as if his lungs had hit their own guardrail. "Are you?" "I'm going to show up," I said. "That's all I've promised. Showing up is when everything starts," he said with a seriousness that made me want to sit down. "My mom says that. How's she doing?" I asked. He looked down at the helmet. "Some days are bad, but she still gets excited when she hears the engines on TV. She said if you race, I can watch from the stands, but only if I wear earplugs." He reached into his pocket and produced a neon orange pair like proof of faith. "I brought extras." "Good," I said, "because you can't tell Hope it needs to be quieter." He studied me for a long moment, his expression tipped toward worry. "Are you scared?" I thought about lying because it's what men do when boys ask men's questions. Instead, I said, "Yes." He nodded, as if that were the right answer. "Then you'll be careful." We walked the first lap together, him chattering about his favorite drivers and the reasons he liked the turns most men hated. Me counting paces and calibrating the distance between my breath and my courage. At turn 3, he stopped. "Coach says this is where people decide who they are." He pointed at the widening arc. "You either lift or you don't. What does your coach say you should do?" He grinned, braces bright. "He says I shouldn't drive till I'm 16. When Wayne waved us off the surface, I felt steadier than when I'd stepped on. My legs knew the ground again. The ghosts had watched and, at least for now, kept their distance. By mid-morning, the grandstands were ribcage filling back up with strangers. Test runs hummed like bees. The paddock bloomed with color tents, banners, men in polos who walked like they were allergic to grease. I kept to the shadows near the back lot where the staff parked, a volunteer lanyard around my neck so no one asked why I was there. The tall kid from the garage, Evan, I finally remembered, showed up around noon with a caravan of friends and the red car from yesterday, gleaming like a dare. He saw me across the lane and laughed. "You sure you want to do this, old man?" "I'm younger than you'll ever be," I said. "Because the track teaches you that age is measured in laps, not candles." A woman climbed out of the SUV behind him, and the air changed the way it does when a storm decides to turn. She was young, 30, maybe, and wore a blazer-like armor. Her hair pulled back so tight you could have used it to tune an instrument. The part of the paddock where she stood looked shinier. Just because she was in it, people shifted to face her the way flowers reorient toward sun. "That's her," Evan said. smug satisfaction in his voice. Avery Cole, CEO. She bought half the sponsor slots this quarter. Thought she'd like to meet the entertainment. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stood taller, because there are some people you do not want to give the satisfaction of seeing. You hunched. She walked over with a stride that clipped the air. "You're Marcus," she said. Not a question. Her eyes skimmed me the way you skin a menu when you've already decided what you're ordering. "I am. She's the one I told you about," Evan announced, as if I were laminated and hung on a wall. "He's the janitor from Lawson's who thinks he can drive." I watched her face for the flinch surprise or contempt or amusement. I got none, just a small, assessing tilt of the head. "Do you think you can drive?" "Everyone thinks they can drive," I said. "That's why insurance exists." A corner of her mouth moved half a centimeter, not quite a smile. "He has a mouth," she said to Evan. "That'll play on camera. But can he keep it shut when a sponsor's talking?" "Only if I'm paid well," I said. "Honesty?" She said. "Interesting." She stepped closer, and for the first time I saw something behind the polished tiredness. Maybe, or a steel that had been heated into shape. "Here are the terms, since boys like to make noise without writing anything down. Exhibition lap. You, in whatever scrap heap you can convince to run. Evan, in the car he thinks makes him a god. If you keep up within 3 seconds over 2 laps, I'll offer you a low-level contracted test driver. Maybe, if you beat him. We talk about something better." She let it hang there, big dressed up as opportunity. "If you lose, you shake his hand like a gentleman and take a weekend off to think about whether working for Lawson is really your ceiling or just the room you got comfortable in." "And if I refuse your terms?" I asked. She didn't blink. "Then you go back to the garage and tell yourself you're above the circus. But don't tell the kid with the earplugs. Don't teach him that the safest choice is always the right one." I looked past her at Eli near the chain-link fence, hands wrapped around the metal, eyes wide enough to put stars in. He had found me anyway. Kids always do. "What car?" I asked. "That," Evan said, pointing like a prince to a frog. The lot at the edge of the paddock held a row of retired machines, test mules, training wheels, bodies with histories. He picked the worst of them for show, a faded blue chassis with mismatched panels, and a rumor of a misfire. I walked over and opened the hood. The engine glared back with the sullen dignity of something used to being blamed. "It'll run," I said. "It'll cough," Evan said. "Then I'll teach it how to swallow." Avery folded her arms. "You have 2 hours. The lap runs at 4. Don't be late." Money hates waiting. They left in a cloud of cologne and confidence, and the paddock noise sank back into a hum. I leaned into the blue car's lungs and listened. She wasn't pretty, but prettiness doesn't win races. Rhythm does. I pulled hoses, tightened clamps, reset timing by feel, because the timing light in the staff shop flickered like a bad omen. Wayne brought me a socket set and a sandwich he pretended he wasn't handing me. Eli stood guard with his earplugs in like a tiny knight. "Why are they like that?" he asked at one point, chin jerking toward the VIP tents. "Because life gave them a stage early," I said, tightening a clamp. "And no one taught them how to share the microphone. You're going to beat him, right?" "I'm going to drive the best lap I can," I said. "Because truth is a gift you owe to kids even when they want candy instead." By 3:30, the sun had burned off the fog, but a breeze kept the track cool. I rolled the blue car to the staging area and buckled in. The belts hugged me like a memory. For a second my pulse stuttered, waiting for fear to pull the emergency brake on my chest. It didn't. It slid into the passenger seat like an old friend who knew I was still going anyway. Evan revved beside me, the red car snarling, the crowd near the fence lifting phones. Avery watched from the pit wall with sunglasses on, a shape cut out of certainty. Wayne gave me a two-finger salute. Eli held up both orange earplugs like a referee signaling something sacred. The marshal dropped his arm. I didn't floor it. I let the clutch torque first, eased the throttle up, felt the blue car find me and settle. Turn one came like a question. I answered with the whole of who I'd been and still was. A man who knew how to make a heavy thing dance. The car coughed. Once habit then cleared its throat like a singer remembering the note. I found the line and followed it like a prayer I hadn't let myself say in years. By the back straight I could hear Evan closing, his engine a brighter animal. He expected me to brake early into turn 3. I didn't. I lifted a breath, let the weight transfer, and my hands did the rest. The blue car held like she'd decided at the last minute she believed in me. At the exit, a flash of red filled my mirror. Evan overcooked it, corrected, skated wide onto the curbing. The stands murmured. Avery's head tilted 3 degrees. Lap 1 down. My heart learned a new word for yes. On the second lap, the blue car hiccuped again at the far apex. I adjusted half a beat sooner on the throttle, a whisper more patience. At the clip point, and the misfire became a metronome instead of a threat. Evan came back strong on the straight, his power undeniable. His youth making up the distance like a story where time bends for the protagonist. But turns don't care how pretty your narrative is. They care whether you keep your promises. Coming out of the final corner, I heard the crowd before I saw the checkered board noise rising like a curtain. Air moving different. I crossed the line and let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I didn't look at the clock. I looked at Eli. He bounced so hard his earplugs fell out and Wayne had to catch one midair. The marshal waved me to the pit wall. I pulled in, unbuckled, climbed out. My legs shook not from fear now, but from the body remembering what it was for. Evan rolled in a second later, visor up, mouth tight. Avery was already there, tablet in hand. 2 laps, she said, eyes on the data. Gap. 1.6 seconds. Evan's head snapped toward the screen. No way, she held up a finger. 1.6. He kept you honest. She turned to me and took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were human, tired and sharp. Yes, but something else to something like approval with the edges filed off. So it wouldn't cut her mouth if she smiled. You said you'd show up, she said. You did more than that. I waited. She enjoyed being the person who delivered verdicts. Tomorrow at 9, she said at last. My office. We'll talk about what more looks like in a contract. Evan made a sound like a tire losing air. You said beat me. I said keep within 3 seconds, and we talk. She slid the sunglasses back on. Learn to listen. It's a useful skill in cars and in life. As the crowd spilled back toward the concessions, Eli wormed through legs until he reached me. He didn't say anything. He just threw his arms around my waist and squeezed like he was afraid I might float off. Over his head, I saw Mr. Lawson, near the fence, his mouth curved into a smile he didn't bother to hide. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a man remembering a life. I felt like a man starting one. And somewhere, beneath the noise and the new offers and the warmth of a kid's hug, the old fear whispered that it wasn't done. It would be back, maybe in the shape of a sharper corner, or a thinner margin, or a woman in a blazer asking for more than I knew how to give. But I'd answered once today. I could answer again. Saturday was coming like a storm front. I lifted my face to the wind and let it find me. The next morning, Marcus woke up earlier than usual. He wasn't sure if it was excitement, anxiety, or just the weight of everything that had been swirling in his mind since the night before. The sound of rain tapping gently against the tin roof made the whole house smell like wet soil and old wood. He lay there staring at the faded ceiling, remembering his father's words from years ago. When life dares you, son, you don't just step forward, you run. Today, he was supposed to meet Mr. Callahan again, the man with the crisp suit, the sharp eyes, and the unsettling way of speaking as if he already knew how people's stories would end. Marcus replayed every detail of yesterday's encounter. In his head, especially that final line, "If you can win this race, I'll hire you." It had been said like a challenge, but also like a promise. He got up, pulled on his worn sneakers. The soles almost smooth now, with just enough grip to keep him from slipping on wet pavement. The mirror on the wall showed a face tired but alert, eyes sharp with determination. His mother's voice echoed from the kitchen. "Marcus, you're up early. Something on your mind." She didn't know about the offer yet. He wanted to tell her only if he had something solid to show. "I'm just going to check something out," he replied, tying his laces tight. Outside, The streets were still waking up. Shopkeepers pulled up shutters, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner filled the air, and the old man who sold newspapers waved at him like always. But Marcus barely noticed. His thoughts were already at the track. The race wasn't some casual neighborhood sprint. It was a test, set up by Callahan, a way to measure more than speed. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that whenever Callahan got involved in something, it wasn't just about winning. It was about how you won. When Marcus arrived, the field was already filling with people. Not just runners, but spectators too. Some curious, some eager to watch someone fail, and a few silently rooting for him. Among the runners were men much taller, bulkier, and clearly more experienced. One of them, a man named Troy, smirked as Marcus walked by. Didn't think this was a charity event. Kid, he said. His friends laughed. Marcus didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that some fights are won without words. As they lined up, Callahan stepped forward, umbrella in hand. He looked over the group like a commander surveying his soldiers. This isn't just about speed, he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. It's about stamina, focus, the ability to keep going when you think you can't. The finish line is 3 laps away, no shortcuts. The whistle blew. The first lap was chaos. Troy shot ahead, his long strides kicking up mud. 2 other runners followed close behind. Marcus kept his pace steady, resisting the urge to chase them too soon. The rain made the ground slippery, and more than once, someone nearly lost their footing. He could hear the crowd's shouts mixing with the pounding in his ears. By the second lap, the frontrunners began to tire. Their breaths came heavier, their form sloppier. Marcus remembered his father's advice about running smart. Conserve energy early. Unleash it when it counts. He closed the gap, passing one runner, then another. Halfway through the final lap, it was just him and Troy. The bigger man glanced back, his expression shifting from smugness to irritation. He pushed harder, but the mud betrayed him. One slip cost him a stride, and Marcus seized the opening. The last stretch felt endless. Every muscle burned. His lungs felt like they were on fire. But the sound of the crowd grew louder, pulling him forward. And then, in one final burst, he crossed the finish line. The cheers were mixed with murmurs of surprise. Callahan walked toward him, his shoes spotless despite the wet field. Not bad, he said, a faint smile breaking his usual cool expression. You didn't just run to win. You ran to last. That matters. Marcus was still catching his breath when Callahan handed him a small, sealed envelope. Inside is your next step. Don't open it here. Read it when you're alone. Before Marcus could ask anything, Callahan turned and disappeared into the crowd. He stood there, rain running down his face, wondering if this was just the beginning of something bigger or if he'd just stepped into a game whose rules he didn't yet understand. I couldn't sleep that night. The images of the day kept replaying in my mind, each one more bitter than the last. The laughter, the subtle jabs, the way they all looked at me as if I were something stuck under their shoes. It gnawed at me, until the darkness of my room felt like it was pressing against my chest. I sat up, the stale air heavy, and listened to the silence of the apartment. It wasn't real silence. There was the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of cars, but it was the kind of silence that made you feel invisible, forgotten. In that emptiness, I thought of my father's hands, strong, calloused, the hands that used to lift me onto his shoulders when the world felt too big. Now, those same hands trembled when he held a cup, and I couldn't be there to steady them because I was too busy trying to survive. That thought alone burned in my veins. I knew they didn't just disrespect me, they disrespected the sacrifices that came before me. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, the kind that didn't ask for permission. I pulled my one decent blazer from the back of the closet, ran my fingers over the worn seams, and decided it would have to do. Today, I wasn't just going to show up. I was going to make sure they remembered me, not for my struggle, not for my failures, but for the fact that I was still here. When I walked into the garage, I felt every set of eyes follow me. I didn't smile. I didn't greet anyone. I just went straight to the far corner where the engine sat, a tangle of metal, oil, and dust, like a puzzle no one had bothered to solve. My fingers itched to touch it, but I waited. Instead, I started by clearing the space around it, every movement deliberate, each clang of metal echoing through the place. Planning to move in here, one of them called out, sarcasm dripping from his tone. I didn't look up, planning to finish what no one else could. I said, my voice steady. There was a murmur, not loud, but enough to tell me I had struck a nerve. Good. As I began working, I felt the grime sink into my skin, the weight of the tools in my hand like an extension of myself. Every turn of the wrench, every click of a bolt felt like pushing against years of doubt. I didn't work frantically. I worked with precision. That's the thing they never understood. Speed means nothing if you can't get it right the first time. Hours passed. Sweat dripped down my back. My hands ached. But I didn't stop. People came and went, glancing over with that same mix of curiosity and skepticism. A few whispered bets about how long I'd last before giving up. But I didn't give them the satisfaction of pausing. Around noon, I heard the sound of heels clicking on the concrete floor. The CEO's daughter. She stopped a few feet from me, her perfume cutting through the smell of grease and gasoline. Do you even know what you're doing? She asked, her voice laced with amusement. I finally looked up, meeting her gaze. Do you? Her smirk faltered for just a second, but she recovered quickly. That's cute, but this isn't some charity project. That engine's been sitting there for months because it's beyond saving. Maybe it just needed the right hands, I said, turning back to my work. She lingered, maybe expecting me to stumble, to make a mistake she could pounce on. But the thing about people like her, they're not used to being ignored. When she realized I wasn't going to feed her ego, she left, the echo of her heels fading into the distance. By late afternoon, the hum of conversation in the garage had shifted. It wasn't just about whether I could fix it, it was about when I would finish. Even the ones who doubted me were drawn to the rhythm of my work, the way my hands moved with purpose. And then, just as the sun dipped low, I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life. It wasn't a polite purr, it was a deep, guttural growl. The kind that demands attention. For a second, the entire place froze. I looked up to see the CEO himself standing at the entrance, his expression unreadable. The hum of the engine filled the air between us like a challenge. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. In that moment. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. And I had. The sound of the engine still echoed in my head long after I shut it down. That growl wasn't just metal and fuel, it was my pulse, my fight, my proof that I still had a place in this world, no matter how much they wanted to erase me. But I also knew victories in a place like this didn't last long. Around here, they didn't clap for you. They waited for you to slip. The CEO didn't speak right away. He just stood there, his eyes locked on the engine, then on me. His stare was heavy, like he was trying to read something between my lines. Weigh my worth without saying a word. Finally, he walked over, his polished shoes tapping against the concrete. "Who taught you?" he asked. I kept my gaze steady. Life, and a father who believed in fixing what others throw away. Something flickered in his expression, not admiration, not yet, but maybe the first spark of respect. "Clean it up," he said, nodding toward the engine. "You'll present it tomorrow at the meeting." It wasn't an offer, it was an order, and I knew better than to mistake it for kindness. This was a test, just another one of their games to see if I could perform under their spotlight. That night, I barely touched my dinner. My mind kept running through every possible outcome. If the engine held, they couldn't deny me. If it failed, it would be the perfect excuse to send me packing. And deep down, I knew there were people here who would love nothing more than to see that happen. I stayed up late, cleaning every inch of the machine until it gleamed under the dim light. Every bolt tightened, every cable checked twice, then again. My hands hurt, my back screamed, but I didn't stop. The next morning, the conference room felt colder than it should have. The executives sat in their suits, their expressions flat and distant. The CEO sat at the head of the table, his daughter lounging in a chair beside him, scrolling on her phone like she couldn't care less. I wheeled the engine in, the metallic scent of oil and steel cutting through the sterile air. I explained the repairs not too fast, not to slow, my voice steady, my hands never fidgeting. The CEO's daughter finally looked up, her eyes narrowed, scanning me as if trying to find the flaw that would make all of this crumble. "Start it," the CEO said. I turned the key. The engine came alive instantly, smoother this time, the growl turning into a confident hum. I could feel the shift in the room, not applause, not open praise, but something quieter, heavier. Respect was like that here. It came in glances, in the silence that meant they couldn't find fault. When the meeting ended, I started to push the engine back out, but the CEO stopped me. "Leave it," he said. "It stays here." A reminder of what's possible when someone cares enough to do it right. As I left the room, I caught the CEO's daughter watching me. There was no smirk this time, just an unreadable look. The kind that made me wonder if I had just stepped onto a much bigger chessboard. Over the next week, things changed in small ways. People who used to pass by without a word started nodding. A few even asked questions about tools, about techniques. But the air was still thick with unspoken rivalry. Not everyone liked seeing me there, and one person in particular made sure I felt it. It started with little things. A wrench I had just used would go missing. A part one had set aside would suddenly be gone. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then, one night, I stayed late and caught him, a guy named Rick, slipping the missing part into his pocket. When he realized I had seen him, he smirked. "Careful. New girl, you're making waves, and waves sink ships." I didn't answer. I just took the part back and kept working. But I knew this wasn't over. In places like this, sabotage wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The next blow came fast. A project I had been working on for days suddenly failed during testing. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because someone had replaced a crucial component with a faulty one. My supervisor called me into his office, his tone flat, almost bored. As he told me to get my act together, I left the office with my fists clenched. This wasn't about the work anymore. It was about pushing me out, making sure I never got the chance to stand in that conference room again. But here's the thing, they didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know that I had spent my whole life fighting uphill battles. That every time someone tried to bury me, I learned how to breathe under the dirt. So I went back to the garage, closed the door behind me, and started over. I worked through the night, the sound of tools clinking against metal keeping me company. The garage smelled like oil and stubbornness, my two oldest companions. Every bolt I tightened was a reminder that I wouldn't let them win. Not like this. I wasn't just fixing a machine. I was rebuilding the trust they'd tried to strip from me. When dawn broke, my hands were raw. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. But the project was ready for testing again. I wheeled it to the inspection bay, knowing that the same people who wanted me gone would be watching for any slip, any tremor in my hands. Rick was there, leaning against the wall like he owned the place. He smiled that slow, mocking smile. "You're persistent. I'll give you that. But persistence doesn't mean survival." I ignored him and set up the test. The hum of the machine started low, then built into a steady, confident rhythm. The numbers on the monitor climbed, steady and strong. For a moment, the only sound was the engine's smooth purr and then applause. Not everyone clapped, but enough did for it to sting the ones who didn't. The CEO stepped forward, eyes scanning the readouts. "Solid work," he said, his voice measured but not cold. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Keep this up." I should have felt relief, but instead, I felt a strange shift, like the ground under me had moved a little. Approval from him wasn't just approval. It was a signal to everyone else. And in a place where hierarchy was currency, that made me a target all over again. That afternoon, the CEO's daughter found me in the garage. She wasn't wearing her usual smirk. "You know you're upsetting the wrong people, right?" she said. I wiped my hands on a rag. If doing my job right upsets them, then maybe they're in the wrong place. She tilted her head, studying me like I was an equation she couldn't quite solve. "You think it's that simple? This isn't just about engines. This place runs on politics, and politics runs on favors." I didn't answer, and she didn't push. She just walked away. But something in her eyes told me this conversation wasn't over. Days passed. Work came in faster. Deadlines tightened, and I found myself handling more than I thought I could. The CEO seemed to notice, though he never said much. But every time he came down to the garage, I caught him watching quietly, almost like he was trying to measure not just my skill, but my limits. One evening, as I was closing up, I noticed my locker door was slightly open. Inside, my personal tools were gone. Not misplaced gone. My chest tightened, the same way it had when I caught Rick pocketing parts. I knew exactly what this was. Another warning shot. But warnings only work if you're willing to be scared. The next morning, I brought in my father's old toolbox. It wasn't much to look at. Dented, scratched, the leather handle worn to threads, but every tool inside had history. They'd been through harder fights than this. And so had I that day. I worked with more focus than ever. If they wanted to rattle me, they'd have to do better by the end of the week. Another project came my way, a high-profile restoration that the CEO himself would present to a potential investor. This was the kind of job that could change how people saw me here, or ruin me completely. I poured myself into it. No shortcuts, no distractions. When the day of the investor's visit arrived, the machine was flawless. It ran like it had never aged, every surface polished to a quiet shine. The investor nodded, impressed. The CEO gave a single, approving glance. But as they left, I caught a shadow in the corner of my eye, Rick, watching me with a look that promised this wasn't over. And deep down, I knew he was right. The days that followed felt like walking across a frozen lake. On the surface, things seemed calm. Work came in. I delivered on time. The CEO's nods grew slightly less rare, but I could feel the cracks forming beneath my feet. The restoration project had put me in the spotlight, and spotlights are dangerous in places where shadows do most of the talking. Rick stopped with the small talk and the smirks. Now he just watched. Not openly hostile, but calculating, like a man measuring the right moment to strike. Then came the order that would tip the balance, a rush job on a prototype, meant for a trade expo overseas. The CEO made it clear. No mistakes, no delays. I knew the unspoken part too. If this failed, it wouldn't just be the prototype that took the hit, it would be me. I started working before dawn and stayed until the clock on the wall blurred. My hands moved on instinct. Every turn of the wrench matched to the memory of my father's voice teaching me patience. But exhaustion makes even the most careful hands shake. On the third night, as I was packing up, I noticed the prototype's main drive assembly was wrong, subtle, but wrong. A single washer replaced with one that was just slightly off in size, enough to fail under pressure, but not enough to notice without stripping the whole unit down. It was sabotage. The problem was, I couldn't prove it. If I accused someone without proof, it would look like paranoia. If I stayed quiet and it failed, I'd be done. So I stayed late again, undoing hours of my own work to check every inch of the machine. By the time I found the second mistake, I was sure it wasn't an accident. At 4 a.m., I put the last piece back together. The prototype purred like it had been born to work. My muscles ached, but I knew I couldn't let exhaustion dull me. The next day, the CEO came down unannounced. He didn't ask questions, just watched as I ran the final diagnostics. The numbers came in perfect. Good, he said, then paused, looking at me a moment longer than usual. You work like someone who's got something to prove. Maybe I do, I said. He didn't press, just nodded and left. 2 days later, the expo delegation came to collect the prototype. Cameras flashed, suits smiled, and for a moment, I let myself believe maybe, just maybe, this was a turning point. But that evening, I found an envelope taped to my locker. Inside was a single photograph. Me, asleep at my workbench, head down on my arms. On the back, in red ink, were 3 words: "You can't last." I stared at it for a long time. not out of fear, but calculation. Whoever sent it wanted me to feel hunted. They didn't realize that I'd stopped running a long time ago. That night, I locked up the garage, sat in the silence, and made a decision. I wouldn't just survive here. I'd find out exactly who was pulling the strings and cut them. The message in red ink stayed in my jacket pocket for days, the paper softening at the edges from being folded and unfolded so many times. I read it over at night, trying to trace the shape of the handwriting in my mind, wondering if it matched the scroll I'd seen on shipment notes, inventory logs, or hastily scribbled memos in the shop. It was easy to suspect Rick too easy. He was the obvious enemy, and obvious enemies are often just decoys. Whoever sent it had access to the shop after hours. That list was short, but not as short as I wanted. I started staying later, not just to work, but to watch. The shop at night had its own personality, quieter, the air thick with the scent of oil cooling on steel, the faint hum of the security lights. I'd sit at the workbench with my tools spread out, pretending to be buried in repairs. But really my eyes were on the doors, the shadows, the patterns of movement. It was on the fourth night that I saw him, Marcus, the parts runner. Thin guy, quick hands, always kept to himself. I'd barely noticed him before, which was probably the point. He slipped into the storage room, stayed for about 5 minutes, and came out holding nothing. When he saw me, he froze for a heartbeat too long, before giving a quick nod and heading for the exit. My gut tightened. The next morning, the shipment for another high-priority job came in. I checked the inventory list against the actual contents to parts were missing, both crucial. When I asked Marcus about it, he shrugged. Probably a shipping error, he said, his voice even. That night, I didn't go home. I parked my old truck around the corner, cut the engine, and waited at 11:47 p.m. The side door creaked open. Marcus again. This time, I moved. He didn't hear me until I was close enough for my shadow to spill into his path. He jumped, dropping the small box he was carrying. It hit the concrete with a metallic clink. "What's in the box?" I asked, my voice low. He shook his head. "Not your business." I stepped forward, my hand closing over the box before he could snatch it back. Inside were 3 precision bearings identical to the ones missing from the shipment. "Where were you taking these?" Marcus looked at me, his face unreadable. Sometimes it's better not to know. Then he walked away, leaving me with the box and 1,000 questions. The next day, I put the bearings back in their rightful place without telling anyone. I needed to understand the whole picture before I made a move. If Marcus was working for someone, I wanted the name of the person giving the orders. But the pressure was building. The CEO's assistant came down with a new project brief bigger than anything I'd worked on before. A custom job for a client whose name made even the CEO speak more carefully. You deliver on this, the assistant said, and the boss will remember it, fail, and he let the sentence hang in the air. A warning without shape, but heavy all the same. I knew then that this wasn't just about building a machine. It was about survival, and whoever had been trying to push me out was going to make their biggest move yet. By the time the weekend came, I'd mapped out the pieces like parts in an engine Marcus's late-night runs, the missing inventory, Rick's sudden hostility, the anonymous notes. Every clue was a gear, and they were all turning towards something I couldn't quite see yet. I decided to set my own trap, not for Marcus, for whoever was above him. The next shipment was scheduled for Monday morning. I convinced the supplier to make an error. Two of the most expensive components would be forgotten in the initial delivery and instead shipped separately in a small, unmarked crate the following night. I left the crate locked in the storage room with a bright red label that screamed its importance. Then I waited. I didn't wait in my truck this time. I stayed inside, crouched in the loft above the work area, where the smell of old oil clung to the beams and the shadows, swallowed everything below waist height. The building was so still I could hear the tick of the wall clock dot at exactly 11:30 p.m. The side door opened. Marcus slipped in, moving with that same deliberate quiet. But he wasn't alone. Rick followed him in. The sight hit me harder than I expected. I'd been ready for Marcus to have a handler, but I hadn't expected it to be the man who'd been in my face every day, the one who'd called me dead weight. Now I understood his hostility wasn't random. It was cover. They went straight for the storage room. I eased myself down the ladder, my boots silent on the concrete. My pulse was loud in my ears. From the hallway, I heard Marcus whisper, "You sure it's in here?" "Positive," Rick said. "This piece will sell for more than both our monthly paychecks combined. Boss will be happy." Boss. That was the word I'd been waiting for. I stepped into the doorway. "Funny thing about stealing," I said. "It's a lot harder when someone's watching." Rick froze, his hand still on the crate. Marcus swore under his breath. "Put it back," I said. Rick's lips twisted into a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "You think you're the hero here? You don't know who you're dealing with." Then enlighten me. He took a step forward, his shoulders squared. "Walk away now, and maybe they'll forget about you." They? Neither of them answered, but the tension in the room thickened until it felt like breathing oil. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up, the red recording light blinking. "I've got enough here to make your boss very unhappy. Try me." For a moment, no one moved. Then Marcus set the crate down slowly, as if it might explode. Rick's glare burned into me. "You're making a mistake." I smiled, though my hands were sweating. "Maybe, but it's mine to make." They left without another word, but I knew it wasn't over. The next move would be theirs. And something told me it would come fast. The following morning, the CEO called me into his office. The air in there always felt heavier, like the weight of every decision ever made lingered in the corners. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. Inside were photographs of me, standing in the storage room last night, holding the crate. From the angle, it looked like I was the one stealing it. The CEO's eyes were unreadable. Care to explain this? In that moment, I understood. They hadn't just been trying to push me out. They'd been building a case against me from the start. And now, the trap was snapping shut. The storm had passed hours ago, but the air still smelled of rain and iron. I stood at the threshold of the old workshop, my fingers grazing the dented doorframe, remembering every moment that had led me here. The echoes of shouted insults, the humiliation in front of strangers, the quiet nights of fixing broken engines while my stomach growled. All of it churned inside me, like a long-forgotten engine roaring back to life. Tonight, all of that was about to end. Across the yard, the glow of expensive headlights spilled over the wet ground. The black limousine slid to a stop, its polished sides reflecting the flickering light of the old street lamp. Out stepped the man who had once laughed at me, who had once looked at my calloused hands and oil-stained shirt and decided I was nothing. He still wore that same smug expression, only now there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Behind him came the woman whose disbelief had cut deeper than any insult, his daughter. The one who had once sworn I'd never be good enough. But her eyes told a different story tonight. They were here because they had no choice. The boardroom coup I'd orchestrated had been quiet, clean, and merciless. One by one, their allies had turned, signatures gathered like autumn leaves swept into my hands. Their company, once untouchable, now belonged to me. And tonight, I wanted to look them in the eyes as they realized the truth. Inside, the warm light of the workshop spilled over the gleaming piano in the center. It wasn't just any piano, it was the piano. The one they'd mocked me for touching. The one they'd said my kind could never master. I had it brought here, to the very place where they had once dismissed me, because I wanted the full circle to be undeniable. "Why here?" the father asked, his voice a brittle mix of pride and confusion. "Because this," I said, gesturing to the oil-stained floor and the smell of machinery, "is where you told me I'd never be anything more than a pair of dirty hands. I wanted you to see what those hands built." I moved toward the piano. My fingertips hovered over the keys, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the steady drip of water from the eaves outside. Then I played not the hesitant notes of a man begging for approval, but the deep, commanding chords of someone who owned every sound in the room. The melody swelled, spilling over them, pulling at the air until it felt like even the walls leaned in to listen. The daughter's eyes glistened. The father swallowed hard, as if each note stripped away a layer of arrogance he had worn for decades. When the final chord rang out, I didn't bow. I didn't smile. I simply stood, letting the silence finish what the music had started. That performance, I said slowly, wasn't for your applause. It was to remind you that a man's worth isn't decided by the dirt under his nails or the color of his skin. It's decided by what he builds when the world gives him nothing. The father looked down. The daughter opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. I turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Oh," I said casually, "the deed to your company well. My company now is on your desk. You can keep the office chair. Consider it a souvenir." Their silence followed me out into the cool night. The rain had stopped, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. I walked to my car, the keys cool in my palm, and for the first time in years, the weight in my chest felt lighter. Some victories aren't about revenge. They're about standing in the same place where you were broken and knowing you'll never be that person again. And as the engine hummed to life, I realized this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of the life they said I could never have.